Welcome everyone to the first in our CyberScholar webinar series, coming to you from the TAC in Columbia, Maryland. I'm your host, Matt Hudson, Director of Research at the Technology Advancement Center, where we focus on cybersecurity projects, small business referrals to government, along with STEM and cyber workforce development. Before we get started with today's webinar, we first wish to acknowledge a significant tragic event in Baltimore, 10 miles north of here. This morning at 1:30 a.m., a large container ship struck the Francis Scott Key Bridge, Route 695, causing the collapse of the center span. Search and rescue efforts are ongoing since early this morning. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the families of those missing and injured, as well as to the numerous responders on the scene. Our CyberScholar series of talks invites leaders from academia to inform and discuss current hot topics in cybersecurity. Our first speaker is David Kliemann from IBM and Marquette University, who will talk to us about improving your cloud security posture. Dave Kliemann is Cloud Risk and Controls Leader for the IBM Cloud for Financial Services, helping clients and IBM partners to understand key cloud security issues, regulations, and risks. Prior to IBM, Dave was VP of Cybersecurity and Technology Risk at Fiserv, a financial tech company. Also a 20-year naval officer, he has held leadership positions in information operations and cybersecurity. With bachelor's and master's degrees from the U.S. Naval Academy, the University of Maryland, and the Naval Postgraduate School, David's currently an adjunct professor in cybersecurity at Marquette University, and he's also an advisory board member for Marquette Center for Cybersecurity Awareness and Defense. David's talk will be presented in 3 segments. At the end of each segment, I will review the Q&A questions and pose them individually for Dave's response. We will not be using the chat feature during this talk, so please just type your questions pertaining to the current segment topic into the Q&A pop-up window. So let's begin. Over to you, Dave, for the first topic.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to help TAC kick off this CyberScholar series. I'm a big believer in we need to continue to drive awareness and education across, whether we're talking government, business, academia, as part of that. And so it's an honor to be a part of that. And to start things off, when we talk about cloud environments, I think one of the first things really that it makes sense to do is what are we looking at in terms of the threats that are out there that are potentially different or modified from what a lot of organizations would traditionally have faced on-prem. And I'll just highlight the fact that what I'm presenting here, these are actually coming from the IBM X-Force security team. They have a cloud threat landscape report. That's what this is. It's the most recent version of that cloud threat landscape. And if anybody wants to get more details on it, the easiest way is just Google X-Force Cloud Threat Landscape. The X-Force team also does a cost of data breach report. They're free for anybody to download. The easiest way is just to Google it. And when we look at the cloud environment and what are the threats that we're facing, organizations face as they put their workloads and data sets and have been for a decade plus into cloud environments, really there's 4 kind of key takeaways that we see from it. Number one, similar to other types of technology, we are continuing to see a big increase in the number of vulnerabilities that are being disclosed that have an actual impact in the cloud. As you can see, it's the number of cloud specific vulnerabilities basically tripled over the last year in terms of what the X-Force team was looking at, and it continues to grow, and it becomes an attack vector that organization or that threat actors can potentially use. But that being said, I really want to emphasize, number two about legitimate credentials. We continue to see this all the time. As you can see there, the most common way that threat actors will actually get their initial access into an environment is to use legitimate credentials. I go back to my time. So you mentioned it in my bio. The last role I had when I was active duty in the Navy was I headed the Navy Cyber Red team. And I'll be honest, it was our favorite tactic back then, and it's still a favorite tactic of threat actors is once I get legitimate credentials, I'm just you. I don't need to have some, deep knowledge or understanding. It allows me to actually move through the environment and do things in an environment without necessarily throwing alerts, because it looks to the cyber defenders, to the network monitoring teams, that it's just you doing things, and it can be much easier to hide. And as you could see, more than a third of security incidents, valid credentials were actually used in those particular incidents. And related to that, number four, we see a lot of cloud access credentials are being sold on the dark web. So it's that is what the threat actors are going after, because it's the easiest. And why do things the hard way when you can be lazy and do things the easy way? When we talk about what credentials for cloud environments we're seeing, actually the top three, it's probably not a big surprise. But one is number one by far is Microsoft Outlook and Microsoft 365 credentials, because for most organizations, that is where you can get access to a lot of potential information. Number two was WordPress, and number three actually was Zoom. So if you think about it, it's access to emails and environments, it's access to websites, and it's one of the top virtual communication paths that are used by organizations to communicate. And so that's the reason why threat actors are trying to get access to them. Um, the number three there, talking about container security concerns, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But the bottom line is, as more and more organizations start to use and continue to increase their use of containerized environments, containerized workloads, then that becomes, if that's where sensitive information might be, sensitive, data that you might want to steal, for example, or you want to steal compute resources for something, well, that's what you have to go after. And we are seeing a response in the last few years where we're getting an increase in the number of environments that that are trying, threat actors are trying to take advantage of those container securities vulnerabilities and container security weaknesses. So, that's kind of just a real highlight, threat landscape. Some of those kind of, when we talk about credentials, that's really an overlap of the same threats that we've been seeing for a long time, but it is something that you have to take into account, and maybe you impact a little bit differently how you deal with it in your cloud environments versus if you have an on-premise environment, or you're just talking about access to an on-prem email system or whatever the case might be.
So we do have one question about visibility. That meaning, maybe can you compare what the cloud service providers can see relative to these cloud threats versus what the end user organization can see, and maybe what tools are typically used by these user organizations?
Yeah, that actually that's a really great question, and it brings up, so when you think about how you are going to protect your environment and your data when you put it into the cloud, It's actually important to I think of it in terms of the tech stack is a really good way to think about it. So cloud service providers, they're the infrastructure and or platform providers where they are. So the CSPs are going to be looking at it. They're monitoring, from a security and a network operations perspective. They're basically operating at that infrastructure and network layer in a lot of ways. And especially with the number of SaaS, when you start talking SaaS providers that you're using, really from a user standpoint, you're really talking up at that top application layer. Like if we think about the OSI stack or the TCP/IP stack in terms of how we look at that, and for you as a consumer, who's actually using that cloud service provider, you actually have to kind of rethink about the way that you're going to monitor your environments and think of it, what's happening at that application layer level, as opposed to, so my time at Fiserv, Fiserv runs a number of data centers across the globe. Yeah, we had access to all the network switches and routers. We had full visibility that would feed into our SIM system. We would have IDS or IPSs that would feed off of that, in addition to the firewalls, where you as a user, when you're in a cloud environment, you're not going to have necessarily all of that level of access, because it's a multi-tenant environment, and that's part of the responsibility of the cloud service provider. So what you have to do is you have to think about, how am I going to look at some of those things, but look at it at that application layer. And you brought up a point about tools. There are certainly a number of tools out there. Each cloud provider has its own network dashboard. It has its own, security tooling that they will use to help you look at it. But a lot of people are in, it's a multi-hybrid cloud world that we're out there. Nobody is actually in a single cloud provider unless they're a very small organization and they have a very small amount of workloads or data that are in a cloud. The reality is, even just with the different SaaS providers, you are going to end up being in multiple clouds, whether you actually know it or not. And so, it does become a real challenge to, how do you actually feed that information for whether it's your IT operations teams or your security operations teams. How are you keeping track of it? There are some tools out there that are designed to be multi-cloud. Now, IBM has one, we call it the Security and Compliance Center, that are designed to give you a visibility into some of your other, and not just one environment, but multiple environments. Even with that, recognize that sometimes the level of visibility you have, when you start trying to go down that stack, is a little bit different. You don't have quite the same visibility that you would have in, like, if you were looking at your on-premise environment. But bottom line is, whatever the way you architect your environment, your workloads and your data and your networking for how you connect all of those in this hybrid multi-cloud world, you have to figure out what tool fits best for your purposes. And ideally, you want to try and at the very least, sends that data into a centralized area. So your SIM or your IT operations teams, they actually have, instead of monitoring 6 different tool sets, hopefully they can reduce the number of tool sets that they actually have to monitor. And it's a real challenge, and it's not simple and easy to do. From an IBM cloud side, we see it all the time with clients as they struggle to try to figure out how to actually make that fit.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions on this topic. Let's go on to your next.
Sure. So So when we talk about, okay, so there's the threats that, that we were just talking about, the threat landscape. There's a lot of, a lot of threat actors out there. It depends on your, what industry you're in, whether you're facing nation state, advanced persistent threats, you're facing cyber criminals, cyber espionage, to sometimes just hacktivists. So there's a whole variety of threat actors out there that are trying to exploit and take advantage that we see across the spectrum. So when it comes to how do you actually mitigate the threats that you face in your cloud environment, I want to talk about several of them here, but I'm going to start off by giving a non-technical answer, and that's taking a holistic approach to looking at your environment. Specifically, I'm a big fan of pick a security framework that you are going to leverage as an organization. I'm a big fan of NIST's cybersecurity framework. For those that are interested, just within basically in the last month, NIST has released version 2.0 of NIST CSF. It's a really great update. In fact, with the class I teach at Marquette, that's a big part of the class. We talk about the framework and we structure a lot of the class around that particular framework and how you would apply that framework to an organization. And the reason why I highlight that is because, it's interesting with the first question that you had. You said, well, what about tools? And and when you take a framework approach, that holistic approach of what controls do I need to have in place, whether they're people, whether it's process, or whether it's a tool, a technology, that's a great way to approach it. Unfortunately, a lot of times we see people will just talk about, well, what's the tool? I had someone once. We got brought on board a new cyber threat intelligence vendor, cyber threat intel tool, and as soon as we had signed the contract, they basically said, "Okay, good. Now we have cyber threat intel." I'm like, no, we have a tool that does cyber threat intel or helps us do it, but just a tool by itself isn't the case. And so you need to take that holistic approach, and to take it one step further. What we really, when you talk about an approach, even a framework, at IBM Cloud or an IBM, we talk about the approach in terms of this: define, implement, and assess. And it's a great approach. It's actually really easy to remember, not necessarily so easy to implement. It actually takes time, but when you think about it, so that framework of controls, that's the define that we're talking about right here, which is you figure out what controls you need to put in place to protect your environment, and it's commensurate with the amount of risk you face, the types of data that you have, the types of workload. There's a whole different, this is a completely different level of what you need to have in place if you're in the financial sector or the healthcare sector, and all of the sensitive information they have and the threats that they face, versus if you're a small startup business, you don't have a lot of sensitive information. It doesn't mean you don't have any. But that control framework is really just the define. You have to figure out what it is that you're going to do and to put into place, but then you have to figure out how to implement that, and how are you going to actually put those controls into practice. And the reality is, when we talk about cloud environments especially, there is so much change and things happen so fast that you need to figure out ways to automate those. The more that you can script it, the more that you can make this automated and avoid the human error. And it's kind of funny, because another thing that we routinely see is, and I'm guilty of this to a certain extent myself, which is, oh, I want to have the human in the loop so that we can see what we know, make sure that we know what's happening. But the irony when we talk about vulnerabilities, cloud vulnerabilities, there's a component of that actually is, it's really just misconfigurations. There's, besides the having your credentials compromised, one of the other very common ways that cloud environments get compromised is a misconfiguration. There's the proverbial I have a storage bucket with sensitive data, and I put that in my cloud environment, and I accidentally make that available to the internet. There have been numerous data breaches that you can read about, from multiple cloud providers. It's not just one. Where that has been the actual source. It was made available to the internet, accessible via the internet, and suddenly threat actors were able to find access and get access to that, and essentially siphon off sensitive data. And so, as a concrete example of what we mean by implement is, in most security frameworks, there is whether you're using NIST, ISO, IBM, we've got essentially a custom one that we've modified. But most security frameworks, for example, there's going to be a control that says you should put some restrictions on who has access to that resource, to that, whether we're talking a container workload, whether we're talking a data store, whatever it is, you should put a restriction on who has access to it. Now, you can do that manually, and that's one way to do it, or you can automate it. And we have for example, one of the things we work with some of our clients on is an automation, so that when it's actually provisioning that resource, it'll actually check to make sure that you've defined, for example, these are the only IP addresses that are allowed to access it. You've put a restriction on it. And if you don't have that, and it's essentially accessible to all, including the internet, then it'll actually potentially stop the deployment of that resource, so you don't deploy something in an insecure manner. That's an example of what I mean by implement, and automating that implementation. And then the third piece is assess. And that it comes down to, for anybody that's worked in the security industry or in the technology industry, you're well aware that just because you deploy something correctly, just because it's properly configured, there's no vulnerabilities in it, doesn't mean it stays that way. Invariably, we have what we refer to as drift, and that your environment drifts, in for a variety of reasons. And so, what you need to do is you need to assess your environment, and it needs to be essentially a near real-time assessment because of how fast cloud environments can change, and the potential for the footprint of where they could be exposed. And it's really it's when we talk about assessing, it's assessing back to that set of controls that you defined in the beginning. And so you kind of need to do that the term that's being used in the industry is continuous compliance or continuous security assessment. And that's what you really need to do in order to make that happen. Is it becomes this loop where you are constantly assessing whether or not your environment has any risks that are associated because that way, if if you see that case, then you can take action, some sort of action to stop that. So, another thing when we talk about just threat actors in general, and whether you look at the IBM's cost of data breach or like Verizon's data breach investigation report, we routinely see threat actors are in their environments for, we're talking months at a time before they have that access, and they aren't discovered, or they're able to take advantage of a vulnerability. It's just not identified and dealt with in a timely manner. So from a holistic approach, that's really a great way to do it. Now, what are some of the other specific things that you should focus on and deal with? I'll start with, the credential piece that I mentioned in the cloud threats. And you have to have strong identity access management. You have to, first of all, you cannot use default passwords, which are still found routinely. You cannot, you really need, if you want something to truly be secure, just even having password-based authentication doesn't do it. You need multi-factor authentication. You need to make sure that it's strong multi-factor authentication. I was just actually, again today, just this morning. So a couple of reports. One, about multi-factor authentication, bypass that kit that threat actors are using. There was a separate report that, and this goes to the whole texting or SMS as part of that multi-factor authentication. That there was a case that the term is called SIM swapping, where essentially threat actors essentially take it so that SMS code isn't sent to your cell phone. It's actually sent to them, and they're able to leverage that. I highlight that piece because NIST has actually been talking for a number of years that if you truly need what they call a high authentication assurance level, if you have sensitive data, sensitive workloads that you truly need to protect, SMS is not a strong form of multi-factor authentication, even though we still see it widely used. And it's not inappropriate. If you don't need it to be high, if you only need it to say medium, it certainly is better than not having passwords or not having any multi-factor authentication. But it's not a strong authentication method, and you have to build that in. And you also have to build in. You have to look at the permissions that accounts and workloads will actually have in your environment. That's another piece to it. The industry, we've been talking about zero trust and zero trust framework, and it's kind of a buzzword. What does it actually mean? But the bottom line is you need to think about, how do I put things, use that least privilege concept in the cloud as just as much as you would in your on-premise environment. And the reason why that gets trickier in cloud workloads and cloud environments is because the way that we would segment our environments in on-premise data centers is different than the way you kind of do that virtual segmentation in the cloud. You have a lot of API calls, you have a lot of access tokens, and so what organizations need to do is they need to come up with more granular policies. They need to come up with temporary access tokens instead of like an account will permanently have access. They need to prevent local users from actually having essentially high permissions within a container environment itself. For example, going back to that X-Force report, they've 99% of the security assessments that the X-Force team did last year, they found workloads with excessive permissions in cloud environments. 99%. So almost every organization has excessive permissions. And it's understandable why, because your development or your IT operations teams, as you're trying to stand something up, inevitably they're like, oh, I need that extra permissions right now so that I can make it all run. I can get it up and running. And inevitably what happens is those permissions don't get taken away, and they don't, and so you end up with these accounts or these API calls with that excessive permission, which then once that account gets compromised by a threat actor, now the threat actor has all the permissions they need to do whatever activity they're particularly trying to do. So, identity access management, it's not easy. It's been hard when it was on-prem. It's just as hard when you're talking in cloud environments. We have a lot of federated identities. We have a lot of single sign-on. They're great. They're necessary. You can't expect individual workers or customers to have to be typing in passwords multiple times or one-time passcodes multiple times. So you need to do those, but you need to make sure that you are creating an environment where it's not being done in excessive permission or excessive access particular way. So, I do want to let's talk specifically on the container side, because, that becomes a real, that's a real challenge, about how people, what makes a container secure or insecure. And there are, if you actually break down when you say containers and Kubernetes and or Docker, what does that actually mean? The bottom line is the containers are designed to be that lightweight way to deploy a workload into a cloud environment without having to worry about the whole host OS, hypervisor, all of that. You're trying to make it so that it's lightweight, so that you can scale up, scale down, depending on need. The best example is retail stores. When we hit the Christmas shopping season, they need extra capacity. They need to be able to scale that capacity up, and you have to think about where in that whole process, the DevOps pipeline that organizations use when they add or update their applications, their workloads that are actually supposed to be running a website or doing whatever the case is, and look about where the potential weak points are. And it's everything from the developers who are, when they're creating a new image, when they're doing something different, to the registry where that's being stored, to the orchestration tool that whether it's Kubernetes or Docker, or Red Hat OpenShift, whatever method you're particularly using, to the containers themselves. Because this is where those vulnerabilities that I mentioned, this is oftentimes where they actually get implemented in that container environment. And again, not to be a buzzword, but it's not DevOps that you need, it's a DevSecOps. You need to incorporate security in all different levels of your container, whatever you're going to deploy into the container, starting from making sure that you're scanning for any security vulnerabilities when developers are working on it, to making sure that your registry is continually being scanned, so that that if a new vulnerability gets identified, you can look right away. And the reality is, you do this so that when you actually are running a workload in a container in production in a cloud environment, you don't want to be actually making changes to it. This is one of those big differences between the way we've seen traditional on-premise environments and we talk about what you put into the cloud. You should never actually be patching a container in a production. That's not what you should be doing. What you should do is you should be fixing, if a vulnerability is identified, that should be getting fixed here in your creation, testing, your CI/CD pipeline, so that it updates the registry. And now what you do is you just stand up a new contain, your orchestrator stands up a new environment, and you stand down the old environment that has those vulnerabilities. It actually makes it a lot easier if you truly incorporate this DevSecOps mindset and this DevSecOps into your development pipeline. And it also helps in terms of this concept of immutable workloads. So workloads themselves, if you never make changes, it creates the opportunity for you to reduce the risk that you face from a ransomware threat. And ransomware is a big problem, and not just for on-premise environments. We do see ransomware attacks in the cloud. I put this slide up here because I really just wanted to highlight from a picture standpoint, when we talk about resiliency of our environments, we talk about high availability and disaster recovery. Those are techniques to keep your technology, your tool stack, your application up and running. Encryption itself is about, how am I going to protect the data when it's at rest? How am I going to do that? But when we are trying to deal with this ransomware attack, you have to have immutable copies of the data and environment that you have, that this logical isolation. for pre-cloud environments, one of the things that we used to talk about for how do we protect against ransomware is, well, the only sure way that you're not going to lose your data is without having to pay the ransom is you have to back it up, and that backup has to be offline so that the ransomware actor, if they compromise your network, they compromise your system, they can't get at it. Well, when we're talking cloud, it's the way that you create that offline backup is it's a logical isolation, and it's an immutable backup. It's a once it gets written to that environment, you actually can't change it. So the ransomware would never be able to actually encrypt your backups, which that's one of the reasons why we see ransomware actors spend a lot of time in an environment, is because what they do is they get that initial compromise. They might find the primary production environment and data stores, and they're like, okay, we know we can encrypt this stuff. But what they do is they are looking through your environment. They're looking for where are your backups so that they can go after the backups and encrypt those also to increase the possibility of forcing you to that people are just going to say, all right, we'll pay the ransom so that we can get our data back, or get it so that we can bring things back online. And that's the other thing too, is it's not just the data store itself. Like in the financial sector, it's not just the bank account information or the credit card info or payment card information. It also is your environment itself. The Maersk incident from 2017 is a great example. I mean, their network was offline for a long time, and they've talked openly about how they recovered from it, and it took a heroic effort for them to recover and actually bring things back online so that they could actually continue to ship containers around the world and do that. And so that becomes a real key point, and in terms of how you're going to how you can protect yourself from ransomware with the cloud environment. And there are a number of tools that are out there. IBM, there are several other vendors that do those. That's all well and good. You've got to figure out what fits best for your environment, and how you do that. The Moving on to kind of related to that encryption and protection component and immutable workloads. That brings up another concept here in cloud environment that has come up, and for a long time in the security industry, we've talked about data at rest encryption. Okay, you got to protect it when it's in the database or when it's on that shared drive or whatever it is. We talked about data in transit encryption. You got to use TLS, VPNs. You got to figure out some way so that if someone tries to intercept the packets of communication, that they still won't be able to read that sensitive information. But there's kind of a newer topic that we've talked about the last few years in the cloud world, which is data in use protection, and the term is confidential computing. And you can Google it. There's something called a trusted execution environment that they're talking about, and the immutable workload that I showed for the container is a good example of how you can create that, not just from protecting against ransomware, but protecting against any type of data compromise or data breach attack. You create an environment so that when you're processing on some data, that you don't allow a threat actor to gain access to that particular environment, whether it's a container or it could be some of the other cloud. I mean, not every cloud environment is a container. It could be a virtual server, virtual private cloud, depending on what it is. But this concept of data in use protection, confidential computing, there are tools and capabilities that are out there that you can leverage in the cloud environment to do that, to reduce that particular access. And what it's designed to do is, from a cloud perspective, if we go all the way back to 2013 and the Target data breach, where targets, where the target got compromised, and there were it was a RAM scraper, random access memory. The threat actor was basically scraping that instance in time in the point of sale devices before that card information got encrypted and sent off. So it was stored encrypted, it was transmitted encrypted, but there was a short period of time where it was actually processing that credit card transaction. That's what that threat actors were doing, and that's what this data in use or confidential computing is trying to prevent, is setting up an environment where, again, it's reduced. It really is along the lines of that least privilege and that extra segmentation in your environment. It's reducing who has access and the amount of potential that someone could get in so that they could steal your data or steal your workloads. When we talk, steal the compute power for something like that. And the last piece when it comes to talking about the encryption itself is when we talk about cloud environments and encryption is also only as good as your key management. And you have to understand how you are managing your keys, that because if you lose the encryption keys, if those encryption keys get compromised, then that is, that you might as well not have encrypted it in any case. And so that's a critical factor for organizations to think about. There are different techniques, there are different tools that are out there, hardware security modules, virtual hardware security modules on different stacks. And depending on your organization, depending on the risk tolerance and risk level that you face, will depend on how you actually do that particular key management. And then the last thing that I just want to highlight with this is, there's been a lot of talk about the digital supply chain. When we talk cloud environments, I mentioned it before, you have so many SaaS providers that are out there that you're using. You have to understand your digital supply chain, your third party and even fourth party suppliers, because where is that SaaS that you solution that you're using? Where is it located? Both from vendor perspective and from a geographic potential perspective. Where are those located? There's a shared we talk about it. It's a shared responsibility between cloud service providers, between SaaS providers, and end customers that has to get spelled out from an organizational standpoint. And you really have to understand that. And when we talk about incident response, that becomes a big thing in terms of, well, who's going to be responsible for doing what, and what information are you going to get? It's not feasible for a client to, for example, tell every cloud vendor, every time you suffer a cyber attack, you got to tell us. That's not feasible, because when you talk about whether, not just the hyperscalers like, AWS and Azure and Google, but, IBM, some of the other cloud providers that are out there. But guess what? Bottom line is we see something every day, because threat actors are going after somebody, and it's hosted on a cloud environment. And so you've got to make sure you spell that out, and you've got to be reasonable. And that's why I go back to, you have to look at it from a monitoring perspective as an end customer. Don't think of it in that, like at that network layer or the infrastructure layer. Think about it at what can you do at the application layer? What can you see? What can you not see? And that's really where a lot of that goes. So that's, kind of highlighting, some of the key parts about what do we need to do to actually mitigate the risk. I just want to reiterate, it really takes a comprehensive approach. If you're just buying a tool, or you're just, it's some SaaS provider, you probably don't have comprehensive security, and you're going to have holes. There's going to be something, and chances are you aren't going to know about it until you actually suffer that cyber attack or that data breach, because you're going to be focused on the things that you do have as opposed to the things that you don't.
Yeah, very good. We do have a question concerning incident response and automation. So you mentioned the importance of automation, especially in configuration management as you set up an environment. So we're wondering, what are the other opportunities for automation in incident response, in the monitoring side of things, to get notified of things at kind of machine speed as opposed to, analyst review of log speed? And then have you seen any trends toward automated response? We might call that maneuver, where at
Yeah,
machine speed you can take some evasive actions.
yeah, absolutely. So, we absolutely are seeing automated response, and this is where some of the AI and machine learning techniques. So the some of the security tools that are out there in the marketplace, and they're all going to tout that they use AI or machine learning as part of that, but they're it's true in the sense that they are trying to leverage a broader array than just what's happening in your organization, and to, number one, help reduce the amount of noise that the security operations, the security defenders have to face, because it's a huge amount of alerts that potentially can pop up. And then the second piece is, you really do need, it's not just enough to have that SIM tool that you're monitoring for security alerts. The term is a SOAR tool, security orchestration and automated response tool. Again, there's a number of them out there on the market. They each have their pros and cons, because what you want to do is you want to automate, the responses where it makes sense. So for example, if you know that, a simple example, like with a laptop desktop device, if you know that if that device ever communicates to your threat intel list of known command and control sites, if you know that that's the case, that you're going to automatically, you want to isolate that device from your internal network or from your cloud environments, then if it's the same action that gets taken for the exact same thing, that's an example of what SOAR tools are really good at automating. And with some of the AI capabilities over the last couple of years that they've implemented, they've gotten, you can actually do multiple steps in terms of, well, I need to do step A, then step B, then step C, or maybe step A is I need to immediately, yeah, if something goes to a command and control site, step A is I want to use my anti-malware tools to immediately conduct a scan or of that, even as I'm flagging it for my security operations folks. So those type of tools that are out there can really, again, they can help automate. Not to delve into the AI or generative AI side of it, but those are examples that where AI, if it's a repetitive task, AI can actually become really good. You can train it so that it will take those tasks for you, and do it quicker, and allow your humans who are actually responding to take a second to they don't have to deal with some of those mundane particular tasks.
Yeah, very good. I think we'll move on then to your last or your next topic.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight, in terms of, it really is a team sport. I kind of talked about, mentioned it briefly at the beginning, business, government, academia, we all need to be working together. We need to share information. We need to bring talent into the industry. And it's ever changing. There's a lot of folks that have been in the technology and cybersecurity fields for a long time. And when we talk cloud environments specifically, we're talking some different technologies or different ways that you're actually going to defend those particular environments. It's not as simple as looking at a traditional firewall or a traditional, taking feed of network traffic off of a router or switch that might have happened. And so we have to continue to improve. We have to make things, we have to share information across the landscapes overall. And as part of that, I do want to highlight a couple of things. And so, number one, IBM has made a commitment to, train 30 million people in technology and cybersecurity skills by the end of the decade. Actually, 2 million people in AI skills specifically. But I will highlight, we have a website called skillsbuild.org that is free for use. It's designed for students, whether you're talking at the high school level or university level, college level. It's designed for adult learners. These are free courses that people can take. You can learn, you can access, you can kind of dabble in some different things. There's other certifications out there, certainly, but some of them cost a lot of money. Well, this is a free way to at least start to build up that repository of knowledge that you have. And so I do want to highlight that as it's something that's out there, because we do need to continue to grow, whether you're in a cybersecurity or a specific um, a job, or whether you just want to learn more about it, or whether you want to learn more about a particular technology, even though you're not in a job that specifically uses that. It's a great resource, and it's part of IBM's commitment to giving back and helping leveling up people into these fields, because we do need to level up skill sets across the board.
Kind of wondering with the current demand for cybersecurity professionals, what degree programs and certification do you see as particularly pertaining to cloud security and that you would recommend for folks listening today?
So I'll start off with, the quick answer is, if you want to be in this field, you've got to have this desire for lifelong learning, continual learning, because the technology is evolving quickly. Just using generative AI as an example, AI isn't actually new, but we're less than a year and a half from when OpenAI released ChatGPT publicly. And suddenly it became all the rage, with everybody. Well, how do I get some of that? I don't even know what that is, but I want some of that. So you have to have this lifelong learning. So it really, 4-year degree programs are great. 2-year, technical or community college programs are great, in terms of helping to build up that foundation. There's, what I would say is, when it comes to certifications, there's a whole host of certifications that are out there, now, from numerous different organizations and nonprofit organizations. Specifically, I'm involved with ISC Squared, with ISACA, the Cloud Security Alliance. When we talk about cloud specific, they all have pros and cons, and you want to make sure that you're learning at your appropriate level. If you're a beginner, then you should be learning the entry level certifications. If you're looking for more advanced because you have skills, then that's what you particularly pick. Don't pick, oh, well, I hear there's this CISSP certification, so I'm going to get that. Well, that's not designed for an entry level individual. And I also want to put out there that for those of us that are in the industry, whether it's government or whether it's in business, that as hiring managers, we need to do a smarter job about how we design our roles, because unfortunately, even though, but another site, for example, that's really great is CyberSeek, CYBERSEEK.org. It's another great site that talks about certifications, talks about job openings. But even though you're going to find that there's, more than 500,000 open jobs in cybersecurity, the reality is a lot of them require you to already have 5 or 10 years of experience. We need to do a better job in the hiring side of, we need to bring in entry level individuals and we need to help train them and we need to bring them up to speed, because that's how, as an entire sector and as a country, how we're actually going to make sure that we've got enough people in the jobs to avoid burnout. They've got the skill sets that they need. They can understand. So, a few years ago, cloud was the biggest thing. Now it's generative AI. Guess what's coming down the road? Quantum computing. And what does that mean to it? And that's a whole nother story and another long session on that. But overall, that's, if you're in the industry, you need to, just have that continual learning about what's next, what are the latest and greatest, because, whether it's at a university program, credentials, certifications, or just one-off learning. And if you're in the business, you need to continue to think about, well, in order to have the strongest team, I need to train the people I have, and I need to be willing to hire people who may not have done that exact job already, which is unfortunately all too common, what we see in the industry, and it becomes this internal fight. But that's really what we're talking about.
We do have another question
Yeah.
from Usman about the physical layer. So he asks, how vulnerable is the physical layer in your opinion, especially for the growing dense optical networks and exponential growth of the number of physical links to support AI pods, for example, or even for edge networks and growing network distributed architectures?
Yeah. So great question. So the reality is, most cyber attacks, they're not necessarily, I mean, they're not attacking the physical layer, they're, you're looking for the easy button as an attacker. We did the same thing on the red team. That's why we wanted to compromise someone's account. That way I don't have to launch some piece of malware that might get detected. Not to say that there aren't vulnerabilities. There are. And that's why you do this layered defense. Like I said, you encrypt data. So even if it gets interrupted, the communication path gets interrupted, then you still haven't, the data hasn't actually been compromised. I know we don't have a lot of time, but you talk about the cyber kill chain, or the cyber attack life cycle model is you look along that path. So not to say that there aren't weaknesses or vulnerabilities that are potential to be exploited, but the threshold for being able to do that tends to be very high, as opposed to the threshold for, I just look for a vulnerability at the application layer that I can exploit, because people can't patch their whether it's their operating systems, their applications, or I just compromise someone's account and I do some sort of man in the middle that gets me into their account, so I don't have to worry about all that. Those tend to be much easier, and it's much more widely used. But it's a great question.
Excellent. So before we wrap up, you've told us about vulnerabilities, the threat landscape, immutable storage and information to kind of prevent damage to these things that may need to be recalled back and reenacted. You've talked about career path and training. So any final words of advice for us, the listeners?
I'll just say that again, there's never a dull day in the security industry, and especially when you're talking cloud security, things are changing rapidly. I'll just reiterate that as the threat landscape changes, you need to stay up to speed on that, so that you can stay up to speed on how do we actually mitigate those particular threats to keep our critical infrastructure, to keep our overall to keep that under control, and not suffer data breaches, not suffer outages, to be able to continue to operate our organizations, whether it's government, whether it's a business, or whatever the case might be. So
Super, thank you. So we do have a final question. Can we get the presentation? Yes, we are recording this, and so it will be available on our website in a number of days in the CyberScholar section. So thanks to all you viewers for joining us today on this, first CyberScholar talk. And thank you, Dave, for an important discussion on
Well,
cloud security. We hope you've
and
learned a lot more about a modern, pragmatic view of cloud security and how you can prepare to work in this field of cloud cybersecurity. I encourage you to follow us at our website, thetac.tech, for future cybersecurity events and future CyberScholar talks like this one. So from the TAC, I'm Steve Hutchinson, saying so long for today.